Introduce Kalina Christoff, who is a associate professor at UBC and has really had a lot to do with neuroimaging mapping of higher cognition and prefrontal cortex, reasoning and creativity and spontaneous thought. Is clearly a field leader in mind-wandering research. And so when we decided we wanted a mind-wandering theme for this year's SFNC meeting, we thought, who better than one of our own on the executive committee, so Kalina kindly agreed to speak. And she's going to tell us about some of her fascinating new work on spontaneous thought and mind-wandering.
Thank you so much, Adam. I want to open with a story. The story of Cheryl Conrad. So Cheryl was a 60-year-old widower in Maui. She was a shop owner as well. And one day on the way home from work, she drove to a number of cars, not parked, but waiting for the traffic light. At least one person was severely injured. And a criminal case, at the time when I heard about this, there was a criminal case pending against her. The civil case was settled, so she didn't owe money to anybody, her insurance was all settled. But the state was wondering and about to issue a criminal case about criminal negligence against her. Now she said she had not been drinking, and she had not been fussing or texting or doing anything that usually distracts you from paying attention to the road. And it was not her intention to cause the accident. Somehow her mind wandered. It was the one-year anniversary of her husband's death, and she was treated for chronic depression, but mild depression. Now, the way I learned about this case was from a letter from her lawyer, who contacted me and told me all these things. And he asked me some really good questions. He said, I have been at a loss finding anyone to answer the question whether Cheryl's mental lack was voluntary or something that a reasonable person can and should control. He said, all of us face from time to time, short of falling asleep, even while driving. Now he said the voluntariness of this state and whether Cheryl has some propensity that may exacerbate or aggravate such a state are the issues we're facing. In other words, what the judge in this case is going to have to decide, typical legal situation, what they tend to decide is mind-wandering something that a reasonable person can and should control? Now, I was very eager to provide an answer to that because I've been studying mind-wandering for some years, and finally, what I do might make a difference in your life. And much to my dismay, I realized I did not have a quick and easy answer to this question. And since then, that happened a couple of years ago, by the way, and since then it's become more and more clear to me why I didn't have that quick and easy answer. And one of the big reasons is pointed out in a recent review paper, but it's also being pointed out by a number of other papers as well. This is a paper that came out from a Dutch group with Matthias Mittner and Rita Fortman, who wrote a review paper about model-based models of mind-wandering. And one of the important things they pointed out there, well, mind-wandering is not actually a unitary concept. Like when we say mind-wandering, the way I interpret that to myself is mind-wandering is not one thing. But a lot of the times we talk about it that way, including in science. And in this case, the lawyer, Cheryl Conrad, kind of approached it in that way as well. And I think one of the key issues that we're facing as a field is to actually understand how is it not a unitary concept and how can we understand it in a less unitary way than we implicitly kind of use it right now. Another suggestion of the same lack of unitariness is very well described in the recent paper by Dan Schachter and Paul Selly, who specifically proposed one possible distinction that hasn't been very much paid attention to. Some mind-wandering happens with intention and some without intention. And there is another thing that needs to be considered in the lack of unitariness. Now, what I want to tell you about today is yet another attempt to unpack that lack of unitariness and propose a novel framework that It's something that I've been working on with a number of my colleagues, and we recently published, including my graduate student, Jordan Fox, who is now moved on to a postdoc at Stanford, and also my close collaborators, Zach Irving at Berkeley, Nathan Sprang at Cornell, and Jessica Andrews-Hanna at Colorado, moving on to Arizona, I believe. Now, the way I got to studying mind wandering was actually even before the word mind wandering was really commonly used by a lot of papers. I was really interested, and even though I was studying executive function, which in the 90s was the only thing you could study as a graduate student, I was always very secretly interested in spontaneous thought. And after I graduated, I felt secure enough that I decided to publish a paper that had spontaneous thought in the title, after managing to publish a couple of executive functions papers. Now, at that time, I put a spontaneous thought in the title because that wasn't the most common term that was being used. Mostly what people were calling these kinds of processes that many were interested in were task-unrelated thought, stimulus-independent or stimulus-unrelated thought. And I realized a lot of these terms are negative, right? They're telling us what it isn't, but they're not telling us what it is. So I kind of challenged myself and came up with this thing that I thought it most likely was, that it was spontaneous. Subsequently, a couple of years later, mind wandering came on the scene, largely by this hugely influential paper in Psychology written by Jonathan Small and Jonathan Scholar, who really put mind wandering on the scene. Up until then, it was not the default effort had come on the scene, but not so much this concept of mind wandering. So this was 10 years ago, 2006. And last year, the same two authors who have been hugely influential, Small and Scholar, they summarized the field and where it had moved after 9 years at this point after the original paper. And what they very helpfully did was they tried to summarize finally a definition, right? I think to a large extent the field has been avoiding a definition of these things because they're so difficult to define. Right? Although of course experimentally we've had to define them. And what they did was they summarized our definition, what we've mostly been using in the last 10 years as a definition. And they describe it as mind wandering can be defined as, or is being defined right now, right, as a shift in the contents of thought away from an ongoing task and or from events in the external environment to self-generated thoughts and feelings. Now, you can unpack that into a 2x2 matrix, right? So the way you can understand that definition, and actually it's the common dominant definition that we're using, right, is that basically we have things that are task-related and things that are task-unrelated. So here on this side. And then on the other hand, you have things that are stimulus-independent in your thoughts and or thoughts that are stimulus-related. So basically what they're saying is that mind wandering is stimulus-independent and or task-unrelated. And when you unpack it, what you realize is that the most prototypical mind wandering is currently in the field considered to be thoughts that are both task-unrelated and stimulus-independent, but maybe, and they put and or there because I guess they weren't sure, and the field isn't sure at the moment, maybe these could be considered mind wandering as well, things that are stimulus-related but still task-unrelated. Something we might call perception distraction, but we might sometimes classify as mind wandering. And maybe things like task-related interference, what's often related to. So when I'm doing a task, I'm thinking about the task, but not, in a helpful sort of way, like I might be thinking about my performance in the task, right? So that would be considered task-related interference. So the idea is that maybe all these, but definitely that is mind wandering. So my argument, and what I'd like to convince you today, is that unfortunately this definition, which I've ignored myself in the past, and been very helpful empirically speaking, because you can measure these things easily, right, is actually not perfect, to say the least. Because this current definition of mind wandering is actually missing one of the most defining features of what I view as mind wandering, right? And if you think the word wonder, just look it up in the dictionary. The way we, the verb wonder basically conveys this sense of motion. The Oxford English Dictionary would define it as to move hither and thither without fixed course and certain aim. So what does our mind do when it wanders? Well, it moves. According to this definition, truly, that's what it should be. Now, William James was getting us exactly that sort of dimension. And since he did that, we haven't actually experimentally really zeroed in on that. You know, he has a wonderful quote where he talks about the wonderful stream of consciousness. He says, as we take a general view of the wonderful stream of consciousness, what strikes us first is this different pace of its parts. Like a bird's life, it seems to be made of an alternation of flights and perchings. The resting places, he described the resting places as the time when the mind is on a thought and doesn't move between thoughts. And then he described the places of flight as those moments when we take flight from one thought to another, when we move from one thought to another. So he talked about those dynamics of thought, and somehow in the century since then, century plus, they began quite forgotten. Largely because, I think, they're actually a lot more difficult to measure than the content of thoughts. And actually that's something William James talked about. He said, you know, it's actually easy to observe thought in those resting places. But when you try to catch it in flight, it's like trying to observe the motion of a spinning top. As soon as you catch it, it stops, and it's no longer in flight. So he talked about the difficulty of observing the thought in flight. But what I like to argue is that actually that is what we need to develop methods to do in order to understand the totality of human thinking, and not just their content, but also how dynamically they change. So here's some very practical problems that we have with our definition, above and beyond the fact that we're not reflecting these dynamics. If mind wandering is like the most prototypical, defined as stimulus-dependent and or task-related, but definitely stimulus-dependent and task-related, what actually you also get is that there are certain types of goal-directed thoughts that are also task-related and stimulus-independent. You can come up with examples of that. If you're at a lecture and you're exploring, you might decide to, in a goal-directed way, think about something better than the lecture. So that would be stimulus-independent, because you might kind of ignore what you're listening and watching, and it will be task-unrelated. If your task was to pay attention to the lecture, same thing might happen while driving on the road, right? You could start deliberately thinking about something else because you've assessed that driving isn't all that complicated. Right? So you could have examples of thinking that's both task-unrelated and stimulus-independent that are actually goal-directed. And that is a problem for our definition. If we're to capture this spontaneous movement hither to thither in the form of mind wandering, because goal-directed thought does not move hither and thither, right? I mean, that's the definition of goal-directed thought. So it actually has a somewhat fixed course, right? So we're having definitional issues already, even the fact that we can't distinguish mind wandering from goal-directed thought. But there's another issue as well, which has a lot more clinical connotations, and that is that in the same cell, you would also put something known as rumination, although you could also put obsessive thought as well here. So clinical type of situations in which thought is often task-unrelated, rumination is often task-unrelated, and it's also stimulus-independent. But and some people would consider rumination to be a type of mind wandering. I used to be one of those people, but I no longer do after a lot of discussions with my collaborators, in particular my philosopher collaborator, who just wasn't steeped in these cognitive assumptions. Rumination, in some way, feels antithetical to mind wandering. And in fact, if you look at the clinical literature, that is what the definitions of ruminations include. The definition of rumination, which is Nolan Kuksema, she provides, during rumination, she says, thoughts tend to remain fixed, right, on a single theme or topic. So they're not moving hither or thither, and that's definitely our subjective reality. Now, mind you, this doesn't have to be a negative situation. You could be infatuated with something or totally excited about something, and your thoughts tend to stay on that thing as well. So it doesn't have to be clinical. You're probably not going to run to the doctor if you're, in love with somebody and you just can't stop thinking about them, right? But you might if you can't stop thinking about how much the world sucks, right? So now here's what we're proposing then, is that instead of defining mind wandering in terms of the content, right, what we need to do is define it in terms of the dynamics of thought. And so what we're proposing is that mind wandering is actually a form of spontaneous thought. And that will become relevant when we try to understand creativity, because that definition also allows us to collect mind wandering to other phenomena, right, such as creativity and dreams. So what we're proposing with spontaneous thought, really, we can define it as thought that arises freely or relatively freely due to an absence of strong constraints on its contents and on the transitions from one mental state to another. Because what is thought? Well, I think thought can be defined as a mental state or a sequence of mental states, right? Including the transitions between them, or in Jamesian's terms, the flights. Right? We can't just look at the states, we need to look at the transitions as well, because that's where the dynamics lie. And then, of course, a mental state would be basically anything that's relatively transient, right? It doesn't last for hours. It's relatively transient and could be cognitive or emotional state of the organism, right? Because these states come and go, they shape our thought flow, basically. And I guess the challenge now becomes, now that this definition now basically says what we really need to understand is how the constraints happen, because that's how we understand when thought becomes free and when it starts freely wandering. So what we're also proposing is that there are actually two fundamentally different ways in which thought can become constrained, and that comes in really important. The one commonly thought of way, and something that we understand actually fairly well, is how thought can become constrained by virtue of deliberate constraints. Right? So deliberate constraints are pretty well linked to mechanisms such as cognitive control and executive functions. So that's the example when you want to pay attention to something, your mind wanders, and then you deliberately bring it back to what you want to pay attention to. Right? So deliberate constraints, things that you're aware of and you're evolutionally controlling. But there's also another family, big family of constraints that we actually understand a lot less. But they are quite different. So we call these, or we started calling those automatic constraints of thought. So some examples of automatic constraints, by no means all of them, because I'm sure that we're not even aware of all the ways in which the mind can become automatically constrained. But two somewhat researched constraints that have been already starting to be understood are things like affective salience. Affective salience, stimulating the outside world, and that's the most researched part, can have affective salience, but also internal thoughts, memories, spontaneously retrieved content and images, they can have emotional salience as well. And that emotional salience is going to draw thought towards it and pose constraints in a totally non-deliberate way. In fact, it might do so against your deliberate intentions, right, to not become fixed on that thing. Other types of salience that have been researched a lot in the visual attention field are things like sensory salience, right? Oftentimes related to some contrast. If you're trying to read a book in a quiet room and there's a fly buzzing, there's a contrast between the quietness of the room and the buzzing of the fly. It's not particularly threatening to you, it just ends up drawing your attention to the fly. You want to get rid of that fly. So that will be an example of the sensory salience, and it does pose constraints to your thoughts, right? You can't just read your book, like the thought keeps going to that sound. Of course, other examples are also possible with anything like an explosion, huge brightness and so forth, would constrain thought in an actually externally driven way. So that's when thought can become externally driven. Although most of our research has been, and the field's research has been on internally oriented thought. So when you look at these two different types of constraints, now we can draw some distinctions that we couldn't previously draw. Because you can basically imagine a very broad two-dimensional space with automatic constraints and deliberate constraints ranging from weak to strong. And so what we're proposing is that spontaneous thought, including mind wandering, which again is a form of spontaneous thought in my opinion, essentially spontaneous thought is when both deliberate and automatic constraints are not very strong. So you can have extremely weak constraints of both dimensions, or you can have some constraints. It doesn't have to be a total absence of constraints, right? But they're relatively weak or like moderate constraints. At a point when they become really strong constraints, then actually spontaneous thought ceases to be spontaneous and becomes something else. Now, what we're also proposing is that spontaneous thought is this umbrella of phenomena that includes mind wandering, but also includes things like creative thinking and dreaming. Creative thinking, and actually along the continuum of deliberate constraints, something like dreaming is even less deliberately constrained than mind wandering. Mind wandering is pretty, in that sense, it's pretty free-flowing, right? It's free movement of thought. But it's at night that our minds become unhinged, right? Totally crazily free, right? And creative thinking is actually, from my perspective, it's a pretty interesting case. On the average, if you can average it, it's actually a little bit more constrained than mind wandering, because creative thinking can involve like crazy generation of totally unconstrained ideas. But crucially for creative thinking, you also want to have deliberate constraint and judgment as to the usefulness of these ideas at some point. Not necessarily when you're generating them, but at some point. So there is a balance there, and there is some deliberate constraints that goes into creative thinking. Perhaps less so than mind wandering, the average. Now, in terms of automatic constraints, all of these would have medium to low automatic constraints, although they would range as well. Crucially here, what now we can do is we can distinguish mind wandering and spontaneous thought from goal-directed thought, because goal-directed thought will be thought that has the highest level of deliberate constraints. That's where we're intentionally guiding our thoughts towards a particular solution or to stay on a task or whatever we want it to do. Now we can also distinguish between mind wandering and rumination, because rumination in our framework is very highly constrained thought, but it's constrained in a very different way than goal-directed way. It's highly constrained in a largely automatic way. Although some rumination actually could be also constrained, like you could believe that your rumination, some people with depression believe that through rumination they can solve their problems, right? So that's not, you could have actually constraints on both deliberate and automatic. But for the most part, rumination is something like obsessive thought, and in fact some clinical disorders would be other clinical disorders as well, like OCD, would be positioned in a place that will help us understand them in terms of understanding excessively strong automatic constraints of thought, so strong that we can't overcome them with deliberate attempts to undo them, right? So we have these proposed advantages that now we can distinguish between mind wandering goal-directed thought, mind wandering rumination, and one interesting thing that we can now also try to do is we can actually start mapping these different constraints, and that's something we're proposing, although there's obviously very little work on automatic constraints so far, is that you can distinguish between the contribution of different brain networks at this point. Logically, and probably all of you already are guessing, what we're doing is we're linking deliberate constraints basically to the functions of the so-called control networks. The most popular and talked about control network is the frontal-parietal control network. Another network, control network, is also being proposed, and that's somewhat more controversial, but also seems to be doing very similar sort of control functions. It's the singular peripheral control network. And we're proposing is that's where we should be looking for the implementation of deliberate constraints on thought. On the other hand, automatic constraints, which I think are going to be the really big challenge for us to unravel and unpack. But we're proposing that they're likely linked to something that's become known as the salience network, or as we call it, the salience networks, because there's another network that Corbett and Schumann identified more than a decade ago now, the ventral attention network, which is actually mostly supposed to deal with information from the external environment, but it identifies external salient events. Right? The salience network, which is a more recent concept, is supposed to identify or signal the occurrence of anything salient, whether it's in the external environment or in the internal thoughts, memories, and simulations. One interesting thing that we're hypothesizing at this point is that actually you could even make a distinction between different components of the default network when you consider automatic and automatic constraints, which you couldn't if you don't consider automatic constraints. So what we're proposing, and that relates a lot to one that Dan talked about in terms of episodic simulation, we're proposing that the default network core, which you see here in dark blue, right? So the posterior cingula, the anterior prefrontal cortex, and the inferior parietal lobule, these core, most typical core default network, actually, they might not be involved just in any mind wandering, but in a type of thought that's automatically constrained. And the hypothesis that it might be automatically constrained in terms of self-relevance. Self-relevance acts as a type of emotional salience. So these are the mechanisms that we need to understand now. But in contrast, the medial temporal lobe part of the default network, which essentially involves, so you see it here in purple, so hippocampus, parahippocampus, retroclear cortex, and the very low ventral medial part of the cortex. And you might consider the posterior inferior But this mediotemporal lobe chunk, we're proposing that's actually involved in the spontaneous generation of mental content. So in the creation of the freedom, right? So if you're going to constrain, you need to have a source of variability that comes. So we're proposing that that's actually the source. And there's some evidence that we already are seeing, although we haven't actually directly investigated that. But a recent study that we published, we took meditators with a lot of meditation experience. Like these were 20 years of experience amongst their roles, we flew them in from different places. And we scanned their brains. What we wanted to do was, we wanted them to just go in the scanner and monitor their thoughts for spontaneous onset. And what we asked them to do was to press a button as soon as they detect the onset of spontaneously arising thought. So they would press a button, and what we wanted to do is, what happens in the brain actually around the time of button, but especially before the button press. Because the idea here is that most people just have this continuous stream of thought, but after many years of meditation, you're able to actually have somewhat discrete thoughts and observe, and you're more accurate at noticing the exact moment when it arises, as opposed to catching it after you've been lost in thought for a minute or two. So what we were able to see is something quite surprising. What we were able to see is this particular mediotemporal part of the mediotemporal lobe and mediotemporal part of the default network actually becomes recruited so much so that it peaks in fMRI signal as far back as 2 seconds before they press the button. So you have activation in hippocampus and parahippocampus bilaterally, in these regions that peaks. Something is going on, something is turning around. So before even meditators with like 20 years of experience can detect the onset of the thought. Of course, that's something that we really like a lot in terms of levels of awareness and see something's going on there that prior to the awareness of those thoughts, and the content that hasn't quite turned into a thought, hasn't quite taken that shape. But another also piece of indirect evidence is something that Dan mentioned as well, is that in terms of creative generation, when we put people in a scanner and we have them do a creative task, this was visual artists that we employed from a local college that trains people on how to be creative. Controversial thing, it's not clear if you can train them, but actually they do. So we put them in the scanner and we gave them book blurbs, and we gave them a task to create a book cover, a visual design a book cover. Now what we instructed them to do is alternate between periods in which they just generate ideas for 30 seconds, and then other periods when they evaluate their own ideas for other 30 seconds. So then we would compare what was more active during the creative idea generation, this looser, more spontaneous, less constrained state, and the creative idea evaluation, which you can kind of see it as a convergent thinking a little bit, but it's a more evaluative constrained mode. And what we see is that again, this mediotemporal part of the default network is what becomes selectively activated, recruited during the idea generation, and it's actually the core default networks become more active during the evaluation of these ideas. So suggestion again that mediotemporal part of the default network is more about spontaneity and generation of variability in thought, whereas the default network might be actually constraining things in various non-deliberate ways, I think. And finally, something that we've seen through meta-analysis of literature on dreams and sleep. Of course, it's hard to know exactly when people dream, and it's actually hard to dream in the scanner too. But what people have been able to do is get people to have REM sleep in the scanner. And what we did recently was we did a meta-analysis of this literature. So basically comparisons of what's more activated during REM sleep compared to waking rest, and what's more active during waking rest compared to REM sleep. And once again, you get this mediotemporal part of the default network, or I should call it the mediotemporal part of the default network, because the mediotemporal lobe is not actually the only part, right? The retrospinal cortex is there, and a few other remote regions. But it seems that the NTL seems to be driving something quite crucial in that. What happens is that that's what's more activated during REM sleep than waking rest. So overall, what we're proposing is that you can understand our thinking, and actually a lot of the networks of the brain, if you examine, if you link to them the functions of contributing to internal variability in our thought. So we're linking the MTL default network to internal source of variability in thought. So it's the little anarchist in the brain. But that creative sources might be the basis of most of our thinking and memory and so forth. Now, the other networks, such as the salience network and the core default network, might be contributing to automatic constraints, and then the front parietal control network might be doing deliberate constraints, like I said. And so what happens is that as our thoughts fluctuate from more spontaneous to more automatically constrained, like we might be hit by something that we're worried about, and suddenly our thought shifts from like going hither and thither to being all with some worry. And then it might shift to something like a deliberately constrained thought. You might try to deliberately get yourself out of that worry because it's making you unhappy, right? So you might think deliberately about some goal-directed thing that makes you happy instead. And so we're proposing that as that happens, the interactions between different networks shift. And so whereas the MTO part of the default network might be dominating in terms of influencing other networks during the spontaneous mode, it might be dominated by automatically constrained networks, such as the DM core and salience networks. And on the other hand, during deliberate constrained thoughts, the frontal control network might be dominating the interactions between other networks and essentially suppressing the generation or guiding the generation in a constrained way of memories and thoughts and so forth. And so to conclude, go back to our original question, is mind wandering something a reasonable person can and should always be able to control? We're not quite ready to answer that question yet, but we're getting just a little bit tiny closer. Because, and this is my opinion, because of course no one can know what was in Cheryl Conrad's mind at that time, but one of the ways to analyze it, and this is the way that I will do it, is that what we see here very clearly is this distinction between, yes, her mind did wander off, right? So she went off task, but, and this is my belief, she was not wandering in the sense of freely moving. So that's, I think, the most likely situation. And this already is telling us about the distinction that we're missing, that distinction between wandering off and freely wandering. And in which case, I think, is pretty crucial in her case. Because what happened, I think, in her case is that through these automatic constraints, her mind actually became captive. It was no longer free. It became captive to these automatic constraints of thought, which very likely in her case were related to these highly negative events that she was going through, probably without her realizing. So the first year anniversary of her husband, this is not most people are aware of it, but clinical psychologists refer to something called the anniversary effect, where on the anniversary of a trauma, you actually have re-experiencing going on. And because most people are not aware, the reasonable person is actually not aware of that. She couldn't have expected to be aware and take the proper precautions. At any rate, but we can only get to that by focusing on these now different ways of distinguishing different forms of mind wandering and trying to understand what I think is going to turn out to be the most crucial, and fruitful part of our thinking to understand these automatic constraints in thought and how they make us go into clinical disorder or happy in some cases, and how they help us function in our everyday life. So thank you very much for listening, and thanks to all my closest collaborators who helped a lot with all of that work.
Thank you. The quick question you actually did mistake. And you have a follow-up that you were
Well, there's a lot to talk about there, and I don't want to knock us off schedule, but I think we're just at the beginning. I mean, as Roger and I were just talking, even phenotypically, right? The different facets of creative cognition. I mean, what makes it so exciting, right? But also so daunting. It's a bit cliche to say that, but it's true. And then mapping that onto something as sort of finicky and temperamental and multiplex as the default mode network. These various attentional and control and executive networks, and then something like concept, combination, or integration in say, perhaps frontopolar cortex. And so, I mean, I think I'd be interested to hear more about, in particular, just as one starting point, maybe something that helps us sort of frame that discussion. how what you found might behave differently or similarly in the context of a convergent versus a divergent creativity task, bearing in mind that even for something as divergent as alternate uses, you still have to then sort of judge, well, am I really going to say that? Does that really make sense? You know, there's still an element of convergence even in tasks that we sort of rely on to be our divergent indices. So perhaps you could say a bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I mentioned, I think creative thinking is probably one of the most interesting paradigms because it combines all of these different processes. In creative thinking, so the rules that usually people try to learn, like when you try to teach somebody to be creative, there are very few things that you can actually teach them because most people just come up with their own strategies. But one of the big rules that actually seems to work is to separate periods of generation and the periods of evaluation. So essentially, and this is this comes from one of my collaborators, Charles Dobson. He's one of the teachers who teaches undergraduates how to be more creative. And he says that's the one most main thing that actually works. And people who have troubles, coming up with new ideas, it's because they can't separate the evaluation from the generation. So if you're, and I don't know if that's been tested in these tasks that psychologists typically use, right? Because creative researchers uses different tasks. But the typical thing is that you actually would inhibit the generation of new ideas if you also evaluate. And that evaluation might come automatically. So it doesn't have to, so it might be hard to undo. So I think that's where relevance to creativity comes in, is that once, I think a lot of these evaluations, like, in common parlance, people say, well, the critic, you have to turn off the critic. So this is actually what creative people do a lot, is they come up with their own strategies of how to turn off the critic, including some people, they, who was it, a famous person would fall asleep with a spoon in their hand. Was it Thomas Edison? I can't remember now. But, they would, and I've talked to other, modern day creative people. What they do is they actually try to be in a state of somber, like in between asleep and awake, and they find that state frees them up. And I think what's happening is, we can easily turn off the deliberate critic very easily. What we can't turn off is that automatic critic, or in our terms, the automatic constraints are the ones that are really hard to control because by their definition, they can't be controlled automatically. So what we need to do is change the conditions that create these automatic constraints. And that could be like, that could happen in many different levels. So I think that's when one of the, from my perspective, that's where, I'll be focusing a lot of my efforts trying to elucidate those automatic constraints. Because I think they hold the key to things like creativity, but also, undoing a lot of critical conditions as well.
I really like the model. And I did, actually, your question ties into a contrast I noticed the release of the executive being a positive thing for the mind wandering. Again, the positive relationship between episodic control and the generative tasks. One thing I've noticed, like in clinics, is in memory clinic, you'll see an Alzheimer's patient, and they do terrible on word fluency, which is certainly related. The thing that they do is actually interesting. It can go one of two ways. One is they just can't come up with words. The other one is actually that they're coming up with words just great, but they go back to the same ones. So they go, dog, cat, goat, pigeon, dog. They cannot remember. So I mean, that relationship creates an interesting confound. So I was just trying to ponder whether that plays in, because obviously you're dealing with healthy young people and healthy old people, which is less of a problem. But how that may interrelate into as a factor of these more subtle, in a more subtle manner.
Yeah, I mean, that's a totally fascinating topic. We try to review some of there's very little empirical data on Alzheimer's and this spontaneous type of thought, but there's a lot of suggestions, Randy Butler, Dan himself, who looked at, what happens with hippocampal damage in various forms. Randy Butler's idea and evidence is that, in fact, the mediotemporal or 1 selectively damaged region is Alzheimer's, right? And so from there, the idea is that you would have impaired generation of variable material,
Right.
which would, and it certainly would, without like.
It's a little different flavor.
Yeah. And what would be interesting to look at is actually the time course of Alzheimer's
are represented in their network, most prominently are dog, and they don't realize they just did that, so they go back to dog. And so it's a difficulty that is entangled with that nonetheless.
Yeah, what would be interesting to do is to have a time course mapping of how different networks generate at different rates. Because then you would have prediction about at what point this person is and what type of pattern of events.
There's actually a group that in the Bay Area that's done that. Blanking is it, but the different networks that generate with the different disease conditions. William, these are all just I should know this. I'll come up with it later and get it back to you. But I wanted to make sure everybody got their book that came in late and got their name tag. And there are a few of us that haven't yet sent in their slides.